On October 7, 2023, Hamas launched a military operation into southern Israel, breaking through the Gaza border fence and attacking the Supernova Music Festival in Kibbutz Be'eri, as well as neighboring farming communities, the city of Sderot, and murdering any Israeli that they found, which resulted in the deaths of more than 1,400 people. That included not only Jewish Israelis, but also foreign workers, visitors, and Israeli Arab citizens. More than 240 people from the Israeli side were then kidnapped and taken to the Hamas side of the Gaza border. In the month since the October 7th strike, we have seen images of Gaza in the news and on social media as a destroyed city, as a place of poverty and potential war crimes, forgetting that prior to October 7th, Gaza was a very economically diverse place that ranged from sprawling and overcrowded refugee camps to luxury hotels. We seem to forget that Gaza was controlled by Hamas, a theocratic dictatorship that is run by a terrorist group since 2006 and being active since the 1980s. We seem to forget that for a region that calls itself the world's biggest prison, their stockpile of weapons is very sophisticated, ranging from rifles to missiles and rockets, and any way that they have attacked and murdered Israelis, including balloons and parachutes and paragliders going across the border of southern Israel. And we must also consider the negative publicity towards Israel, much of it on social media, where pro-Israel voices are heavily outnumbered, where Jews are described as settlers and colonists and occupiers, forgetting the continued presence of Jewish people in the land of Israel, and that includes the Gaza Strip over the centuries. This video is designed to set the record straight, to point out the long history of the Jewish people in this region. We look at images of Gaza, we recognize that the majority of its population is the Palestinian refugees settled across 8 UN-administered camps. But what began as tent camps in 1948 became modular housing, became apartments, became crowded neighborhoods, that today, when we look at places like the Jabalia refugee camp, they don't look like the conventional refugee camp. They look like urban neighborhoods. The only difference is between Jabalia and the old city of Gaza is the legal status of the residents, that the people who live in Jabalia used to live in what is now southern Israel. And rather than accepting their historical reality, becoming citizens with the same status as the older residents of Gaza, people in Jabalia still seek to return to southern Israel, not as Israelis, not as equal citizens, but by displacing the Jews in a state of Palestine that would run from the river to the sea. Indeed, Jabalia has been a hotbed of extremism, anti-Israel and anti-Jewish militancy. We look at the Israeli strikes on northern Gaza, which includes a good number of hospitals, forgetting that there was warning given to these hospitals to evacuate. There were humanitarian quarters created that were blocked by Hamas, and there are Hamas tunnels and offices located underneath these civilian buildings. We must also recognize another thing that's underneath Gaza besides tunnels: archaeology, that includes Arab and Byzantine and Roman and Canaanite and Egyptian and ancient Jewish places. It is one of the earliest places of Christianity. And even before then, there have been ruins found of pagan temples and synagogues. In Gaza, all one has to do is just dig, and they'll find human history, covered by layers of other human history, which eventually is covered up by the modern city of today. Among those examples was a synagogue from the 6th century, uncovered in the 1950s, that has a mosaic of King David appearing as Orpheus, an example of Hellenism, the Greek culture penetrating into the Jewish religion. This mosaic, partially destroyed, was found during the Egyptian occupation of Gaza and recorded by Israelis, and then copied, that now appears in Israeli museums. It's located near the seaport area of Gaza. The city itself located an important trade route that connected the Levant and Mesopotamia to ancient Egypt. And books have been written about the Jewish presence in ancient Gaza. Much of the city walls have been destroyed by centuries of development, but there are still a few gates to be found. Gaza is mentioned at the very beginning of Genesis. as a place where Abraham went and part of that promised land. But it was also inhabited by the Plishtim, or Philistines. The Egyptians recognized them as the sea peoples, and so did the ancient Israelites. Sea peoples meaning people who came from the southern Greek islands and settled along the coast of the Levant. So if you're wondering whether the Philistines are native or indigenous to the Gaza Strip, it is questionable, as they had originated from elsewhere. And it's really hard to track down who were the original inhabitants of the land. As the lands of the Promised Land were allocated to the 12 tribes upon their return from Egypt through the Sinai Desert, the Gaza Strip was assigned to the tribe of Judah, or Yehuda, the largest of the tribes in terms of population, with portions of the Negev Desert nearby assigned to the tribe of Shimon, or Simeon, that later assimilated into Judah. But this was a land that was a hotbed of resistance to the Jewish return. And among the big stories in the Jewish Testament, the Tanakh, as we call it in Judaism, is a story of Shimshon, or Samson, one of the judges who had fallen in love with a Philistine woman, Delilah, and settled in Gaza with her. She had cut off his hair and he lost his physical strength. Taken captive, he was taken to the temple of Dagon on the highest point in Gaza city. And it was there that he prayed to God for one last time, regaining his strength, bringing down the pillars, killing everybody in the temple, including himself. On this map, you see a city of Zorah, deeper in the valley of Sorek, between the lands of Dan and Yehuda, where earlier in his life, Samson had carried the gates of this temple and the city back home as a prize. And after being killed in Gaza, Samson's body was taken back to his hometown where it was buried. The site of the Temple of Dagon is believed to be today is the Omari Mosque, the Mosque of Omar, also known as the Great Mosque of Gaza. Prior to being a mosque, this was a Crusader church. Before then, it was a mosque. And before then, it was a Byzantine church. And before then, it was a Canaanite temple or Philistine temple. It's a common history throughout the world where one religion succeeds another by building on top of their previous holy sites. Another place in Gaza associated with Samson was a building photographed that's in the Library of Congress photo collection in the early 20th century, a building called Samson's Gate. Samson is part of the Christian and Muslim history as well, being one of the monotheists of those ancient times. But I mentioned that although Samson had destroyed the Temple of Dagon, Gaza had remained a Philistine hotbed and included nearby cities of Ashkelon and Ashdod, down to Rafah. That for a long time, it was a place that was difficult for the ancient Israelite and kings of Judah to conquer. It had been an important coastal trade route used by Egyptians as their route towards invading the land of Israel, and also used later by the Assyrians and Babylonians and the Persians on their conquests to Egypt. So an important trade route that connected the Middle East to Africa was along the Gaza coast. This is a picture of the Sea Peoples in a low relief sculpture found in Egypt. I mentioned earlier that there was an ancient kingdom of Israel, but after the death of King Solomon, or Shlomo, or Suleiman, as he's known in Arabic, the kingdom had split into two, the kingdom of Israel to the north and Judah to the south. Judah was unable to conquer the Philistines. Israel was eventually broken up by the Assyrian conquest of 722 BCE, and Judah had remained until 586 when the Babylonians had swept in. Jewish independence would be regained a few centuries later under the Hasmoneans, also known as the Maccabees, roughly the years 160, 170 roughly BCE. And even though we celebrate Hanukkah as an 8-day miracle of lights where the Temple of Jerusalem was restored, the Hasmoneans throughout their entire history was continuous warfare to conquer not only the lands around Jerusalem, but to retake the entirety of the Promised Land under Jewish control. And it was around the time of King Alexander Yanai, or Alexander Jannaeus, 103 to 76 BCE, that the Hasmoneans had been able to capture Gaza. But Ashkelon remained an outpost of opposition to Jewish independence. The people there, descendants of Canaanites and Philistines, who had been Hellenized following the Greek culture and religion by that time. And by then, the Hasmoneans also, after a couple of generations, had become Hellenized, less orthodox in their Jewish observance, and more culturally friendly towards the Greeks. After the Hasmoneans came the Romans, and then the Byzantines. And it was somewhere in the 500s AD or CE on the common calendar that there was a synagogue built in the coastal area of Gaza that included a column with a menorah on it and what looks like laurel leaves, a combination of Greco-Roman art and Jewish art. And underneath it, the name of the donor who provided this sculpture. It says Anania or Hanania. This column was later recycled after the area became Muslim and put into the Great Mosque of Gaza. This menorah had survived over the centuries, all the way into the 1970s, when it was wiped off the column during a period of Palestinian militancy that aimed to erase Jewish history in the Gaza Strip. During the Roman period, Gaza continued to be an important crossroads of trade between Africa and the Middle East. And although Jews had been expelled from Jerusalem, smaller Jewish communities were permitted to remain in northern Israel and in southern Israel. And during this time, the Babylonian Talmud was written in modern-day Iraq, taking the Jewish oral law and putting it into writings so it would not be lost as the Jewish population was spreading throughout the world. And there were debates in the Talmud whether Gaza was part of the land of Israel or not. That question was important not just for political reasons, but religious reasons, whether the law of Shemitah, letting the farmland rest on the seventh year, whether the second day of Jewish holidays should be kept in Gaza, and why not? Why isn't it part of the Holy Land if it was the part of the Promised Land? Because for much of the history of the first and second temples, Gaza was not part of the kingdoms of ancient Israel. And still today, the rabbis debate whether Gaza is religiously part of the land of Israel, though they all agree that historically it is part of the Promised Land that was allotted to the tribes of Israel. So there was a very small community there as Gaza gradually transitioned from paganism, the polytheism of the Greek, Roman, and earlier periods, towards the Eastern Christianity promoted by Saint Porphyrius. There's a church named after him in the old city of Gaza, one of the oldest in Christianity. By the 400s, Gaza had become exclusively Christian, as the former persecutors of Christianity were now persecuting the pagans. And it was in the 500s that Hashim, a great-grandfather of Muhammad, the founder of Islam, had lived in Gaza as an important merchant and founder of the line called the Hashemites, whose descendants include the royal family of Jordan. The stories of a Jewish presence in Gaza can also be found in the Cairo Geniza, old Jewish religious documents that were kept hidden in a storeroom inside a synagogue in old Cairo that were uncovered by a Jewish researcher and rabbi Solomon Schechter. Yes, important name in conservative American Judaism. He's sort of like the Jewish Indiana Jones. And among the writings, he found a lot of documents testifying to the earlier Samaritan presence in Gaza that had largely gone away in the time of the early Islam, as well as the Karaites, the breakaway sect of Judaism, also had a presence in Gaza, but was also ephemeral. The presence of mainstream Judaism in Gaza was much longer, though it was very small. You can also read about the history of Jews in Gaza from Meshulam of Volterra, not as ambitious as Marco Polo or Benjamin of Tudela. Meshulam of Volterra in the 1400s had traveled around Egypt, what was then Mamluk Palestine and the Levant and Cyprus and the Greek islands, as well as the Adriatic Sea, returning to Venice. Also, the Jewish history in Gaza, its continuous history throughout the centuries, could also be found in books written by Haggai Hoberman, a journalist and former resident of the Gush Katif settlements. His books in Hebrew include Kehila Yehudit Be'aza, meaning the Jewish community of Gaza, and Sharashim Bicholot, Roots in the Sand, that talks about the modern Gush Katif settlements, which we'll speak about later. This is an illustration of the Gaza ruins by David Roberts, a British painter in the 1840s. Another stories of a Jewish settlement in Gaza takes us to the 1600s, early 1600s, when Rabbi Israel Najara, a descendant of Sephardic Jews of Spain who was born in Damascus and later lived in Hebron, also served as the chief rabbi of this Gaza city. It was here that he wrote the very famous Shabbat or Sabbath poem and song, Kari Bon Olam, about God as the master of the world. This song is sung at countless Shabbat tables during the meals by Ashkenazim and Sephardim alike. There are streets named after Rabbi Israel Najara throughout modern Israel. And his son, Rabbi Moshe, or Moses Najara, also served as the chief rabbi of the city of Gaza. At the time, the Gaza Jewish community was largely connected to the Hebron Jewish community, another ancient holy city that is within the claimed borders of the Palestinian state, that is majority Muslim, but has a historic Jewish presence going back to the tomb of Abraham. There was a plague in Hebron in 1610 that resulted of some of the Jews from Hebron moving to Gaza City. Rabbi Israel Najara was buried in Gaza City, but his burial site has been covered up by centuries of development that it is unknown today. Gaza City is also known for another famous Jewish individual, Nathan of Gaza. Nathan Levi of Gaza, originally from Jerusalem, had settled in Gaza. He was a Mikubal, a study of Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism, and here he had visions that he was the messenger of the Messiah. He had anointed Shabtai Tzvi, originally of Izmir or Smyrna in Turkey, as the Jewish Messiah. But Shabtai Tzvi was believed to have had all kinds of mental issues, and largely was famous for what we call matir asurim, permitting what is forbidden, and turning Judaism upside down. And the rabbis recognized that this was a personality cult. This was a false messiah. Eventually, Shabtai Tzvi was arrested by the Turkish Sultan and on the pain of death converted to Islam. Some of his followers had followed him into Islam, becoming the Turkish Donme sect, while other Sabbatarians had returned to mainstream Judaism. Nathan of Gaza died in Smyrna in Turkey, but forever his name is known as Nathan of Gaza because it was in Gaza City synagogue where he announced Shabtai Tzvi as the Messiah, though the rabbis of Gaza City had rejected this claim and banished him from the city. And yet to this day, he's known as Nathan of Gaza. Moving forward to 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte, the French commander who later declared himself emperor, was on a mission to conquer Egypt and the Levant, opening up trade routes between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea in this early example of 19th century European imperialism. Napoleon viewed himself as a carrier of the Enlightenment, of secular government and science, carrying out archaeological expeditions. This is a painting, I forgot if this was Delacroix, I think it was Géricault, showing Napoleon visiting a leper colony in Jaffa, though it's believed that he was actually pretty disgusted by the patients and might have even ordered them killed. But here he appears as a sympathetic visitor with you see a minaret tower, pointed arches, and a French flag. Within Gaza City, he had stayed for 3 days, and the castle where he had stayed is now a Palestinian museum. When Napoleon invaded Gaza, the Jewish community had fled, fearing destruction of the city. Upon the defeat of Napoleon by combined British and Turkish forces, the Jewish community had returned to Gaza, but it was a very small community throughout the early 19th century. This is a map of Gaza City in the 1840, made by the British, showing a very tiny city, small maze of streets on a hilltop, a bit of a distance from the coast, much smaller than the city of more than 1 million that we know today. Going forward to the 1880s, the Zionist movement is gaining ground. The idea that the persecuted Jews of Russia should move to the Holy Land and rebuild the communities of ancient times in a land where we have a history, we as Jews. It was then that Zev Kalonymus Vysotsky of the Vysotsky tea fortune, the Vysotsky teas, one of the few successful Orthodox Ashkenazi Jews in Imperial Russia, had proclaimed that Gaza could be like Panevėžė. Panevėžė is a town in Lithuania famous for its yeshiva learning. He envisioned Jews settling in Gaza, continuing on their long history there. And among those who heeded that call were Abraham Chaim Shalosh, who originally came from an Algerian Jewish family, among the early Sephardic pioneers of places like Lod and other cities in central Israel, Abraham Chaim Shalosh, Nisim El-Kayim, also from a Sephardi family, and his wife, Mazal El-Kayim. They were among the settlers in Gaza, and they built good relations with the city's Muslim leaders, a very small community that was not regarded as a threat by the Arabs. It was also during that time, later in the late 19th, early 20th century, that Rabbi Nisim Binyamin Ohana, also from an Algerian Jewish family, who served as the chief rabbi of Gaza. At that time, there were Christian missionaries who were building a clinic in Gaza City. The Muslim leaders were fearful of these missionaries, and it was at that time that a remarkable thing happened. Rabbi Ohana had met with the mufti of Gaza City, and they co-authored a book on how to answer a heretic, meaning an anti-missionary pamphlet. That book resonated among the Jewish and Muslim residents of Gaza in spiritually fighting back against the Christian missionaries. Comes to World War I, the Central Powers of Ottoman Turkey, Austria-Hungary, and the German Empire fighting against the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia, and later the United States. In 1917, General Edmund Allenby of the British forces had stormed into Turkish Palestine, coming north from Egypt into the Sinai Desert, and there were 3 battles of Gaza. So Gaza was also a very stronghold of Turkish resistance, where the Turks had attempted to prevent the British from storming into Palestine. On the onset of the British attack, the Jewish community of Gaza City had fled for their safety. When the British had finally conquered the city, Gaza was in ruins for Jews and Muslims alike. But the community returned and rebuilt. Still, it was less than 50 families at the time, a very tiny community of Jews in Gaza City. The Arabs had supported the British advance because of the agreement between Lawrence of Arabia and Faisal of the Hashemite family, where the British promised an Arab independent state in the Middle East. But at the same time, the British under Lord Balfour, the Foreign Secretary, had also promised a Jewish national homeland to the Jews in the Middle East, conflicting promises given to the Jews and the Arabs by the British that had seeded the conflicts that would follow in the decades to come. The Jews had returned to Gaza City. Among the interesting remnants of the British advance into Gaza City is the British military cemetery in Deir al-Bala. Any British soldier who dies anywhere in the world is buried in a cemetery maintained by the British government. And in Gaza City, there is a British military cemetery that has at least 5 Jewish servicemen from England buried there, with the Star of David visible. Shortly after establishing the cemetery, the Jarada family of Gaza was hired by the British to maintain the cemetery, and it continues like that to this day. You can ask the Jarada family, what about the Jewish tombstones there? The Jaradas regard these tombstones not so much as Jewish, but as British, comrades in arms with their Christian fellow fighters. And so they remain in Gaza City undisturbed. Today, it is the only Jewish cemetery known within the Gaza Strip. It's believed that after 1967, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan wanted to rebury these Jews within Israel proper, but the Jarada family said, take it up with the British government. And so, still there today. Names like Private J.I. Breslau of the Royal Fusiliers, who died at age 42 in 1918, just a month short of the end of World War I, and says, deeply mourned by his wife and children, God grant that his soul may rest in peace. To think, can the Breslauer family today visit Gaza Strip? Probably not. Whether they live in Britain or in Israel or somewhere else today. Likewise for H. Goodfriend, who died at age 28 from London in 1917. Where are his descendants today? Or his relatives? I doubt they have much of a connection with this cemetery. You can read it in Stuart Hathaway's book, From Gaza to Jerusalem, on the British battle for Gaza City. And so from 1917, for the next 2 decades, Gaza City became part of the British Mandate of Palestine, an uncertain future for this land, where the Zionists had wanted a Jewish state, but the Palestinian Arabs wanted an independent Arab state. It was during this time that the mayor of Gaza City was Said al-Shawa, Hajj Said al-Shawa, an important Arab notable from a historic Gazan family. In 1920, there were riots against the Jews, staged by Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, who later became a Nazi collaborator. The Jewish community of Gaza fled the city, but with promises of protection from Said al-Shawa, they returned to Gaza City, settling in the Zaytun neighborhood, which has a historic Jewish presence, nicknamed the Jewish Quarter of Gaza. Zaytun is also where you have the Church of St. Porphyrius, because throughout the Arab world, the Sharia law segregated believers from non-believers, and usually the Christian ghettos were right next to the Jewish ghettos in places like Jerusalem or Damascus or Baghdad and many other places. 1929, there was another Arab revolt that had sparked violence throughout British Palestine. The Jewish communities of Silwan or Shiloah in Jerusalem, in Hebron, where there were 67 Jews murdered, as well as smaller Jewish clusters in places like Tulkarm and Nablus, also known as Shechem, and Jenin, were forced to flee. Within Gaza City, the 44 Jews who had lived in the city at the time were holed up in a hotel as an Arab mob pelted them with stones. Said al-Shawa, in cooperation with the British police, had escorted them on a truck to the Gaza train station, from where the last Jews of Gaza City were taken to Lod, surviving. Said al-Shawa personally promised them protection during that evacuation. The railroad in Gaza City, by the way, was built by the Ottoman Turks and later maintained by the British, running from Turkey along the Levant to Egypt, this important crossroads railroad that would later be abandoned in the War of 1948. So yeah, Gaza used to have a mass transit system that is now all but forgotten. We go forward to 1930. Tuvia Miller, a Zionist pioneer, purchases land in central Gaza for a Jewish settlement. At the time, that land was uninhabited. It was an open plain. And he named it Kfar Darom, village of the south. Darom was a Talmudic period village, somewhere in the early 200s to 500s in southern Gaza, where Jews had lived. But there was not enough interest among the Jewish pioneers to settle there, too far from the nearest other Jewish settlements, too deep among the majority Arab population, especially after the 1929 revolt, and then there was another revolt in 1936 to 1939, the Second Arab Revolt. And so Kfar Darom would only be established in 1946. This is a famous photo from a photographer, Robert Capa, award-winning American war photographer, showing Jews praying the morning prayers in Kfar Darom, somewhere between 1946 and 1948. It's really just a small collection of shacks. But in 1948, when the Israeli War of Independence was taking place, what the Palestinian Arabs called the Nakba, or disaster, or what Wikipedia, in its impartial manner, calls the Israeli-Arab War of 1948, Kfar Darom withstood Egyptian attacks, but it could not withstand them for too long. It was a tiny community against a large army. So Kfar Darom had to be evacuated. But communities further to the north along the coast of Israel, such as Yad Mordechai and the cities of Ashkelon and Ashdod, were able to withstand the Egyptian thrust towards Tel Aviv. So Kfar Darom was able to say that they were responsible for contributing towards Israeli independence against the Arab attempts to snuff out the newborn Jewish state. From that point, it should be mentioned that Gaza's population had ballooned from less than 100,000 to more than 300,000, more than two-thirds of its population comprising of Palestinian Arab refugees, mostly Muslims, mostly of Bedouin descent, from the cities and towns that surrounded Gaza, what we today call the southern district of Israel. It was there that an ancient city of Ascalon became Ashkelon as Arabs moved out and Jews moved in, and Isdud became Ashdod, where I have some family members living today. There's debate on how these refugees became who they are. Were they forced out by Jewish violence, or did they leave on their own, expecting promises from Arab leaders that once the Jews are defeated, they can return to their homes? It was a combination of a few things: fear of war for their own safety, promises from the Arab leaders that they could return to their homes, as well as some violence from the Israelis. These refugees settled around Gaza City in UN-administered camps. In the early years of those following the 1948 war, there were some attempts by Egypt and the UN to give them permanent settlement in Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula, but most of the refugees refused. They wanted only one thing: to return to their former homes once Israel is destroyed. Here we see a map of the British Mandate of Palestine divided by the UN Partition Plan of November 1947. The Arab state would have included portions of the Negev Desert and the Gaza coast up to Ashdod, as well as the highlands of Judea and Samaria, while Jerusalem and Bethlehem are an international zone. Jewish land would have been mostly the Negev Desert, largely unpopulated, where the waves of Holocaust survivors and Jewish refugees could settle. But in the aftermath of the war, Ashdod and Ashkelon became part of Israel, and the proposed Arab state around the Gaza Strip was reduced to a much smaller area. The West Bank, Judea and Samaria were administered and annexed by Jordan, while Gaza Strip was taken by Egypt, with the Egyptians claiming that they were taking care of the Palestinians until Israel would be defeated. Gaza was not exactly annexed to Egypt. It was run as a military-controlled territory. Gazans did not receive Egyptian citizenship. During that time, from 1948 to 1956, the Egyptians had sponsored Fedayeen attacks that were hit-and-run attacks into neighboring Israeli communities, and then the attackers would run back into Gaza, back and forth attacks. And gradually over the years, the Egyptians also blockaded the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, isolating Israel, until we came to the conflict, the 1956 war, where Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser took the Suez Canal from the Anglo-French companies. What the Arabs called the tripartite aggression is where the Israelis teamed up with the British and French. The British and French wanted to preserve their colonial holdings on the Suez Canal, while the Israelis wanted to put an end to the Fedayeen attacks from Gaza. The Israeli army stormed into Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula. And here we get to 4 months of uncertainty. Would Gaza become part of Israel or something else? During this time, you could see that images from that time of Gazans holding up their hands in surrender to the Israelis. Israelis attempting to rebuild the railroad along the Gaza Strip. The military headquarters with the Israeli flag in the center of Gaza City. And then something you would not see today. The appointed mayor of Gaza City, Rushdie al-Shawa, the son of Said al-Shawa, alongside Israeli officers. What is going on here? Is he a collaborator? He certainly did not view himself that way. He believed very much in Palestinian statehood, but he also believed in pragmatism, that Israel's in control, and you need water, electricity, food, all the other basics of life, and cooperation was the pragmatic solution of that time. So that's why you see here the mayor of Gaza City wearing a fez cap alongside Israeli officers under an Israeli flag. Israel opened up post offices, 4 post offices in the Gaza Strip in 1956, showing the Israeli flag above the minarets on those commemorative envelopes. Here's a ribbon cutting at one of those post offices. And for philatelists, postage stamp collectors and envelope collectors, there's quite a collection of those showing Israeli tours to Gaza, civilian auto traffic to Gaza, where Jews would go for some cheap auto parts and food and other goods. Occupation of the Gaza Strip on this envelope, notice, kept separate as an entity from the Sinai Peninsula, and other images, including Samson carrying the pillars of the Temple of Gaza. So a biblical reference during this early time. And you have another image here, a map of Gaza City, as well as the post office in Rafah in southern Gaza Strip on the Egyptian border, the train service promising to return. But notice it says Rafah, Palestine, along with Hebrew letters. Very uncertain legal status. During this time, Israel would not allow the refugees living in Gaza to return to their old homes in southern Israel. They would not give them Israeli citizenship. And the refugees, in turn, while they wanted to return home, they did not want Israeli status either. So they continued to live in UN-administered refugee camps that were now developing into neighborhoods. These are other images showing Gaza of that time. Israeli occupation of Gaza. I should point out that this collection I found online comes from Silver Spring, Maryland resident Stephen Zwillinger of an online exhibit. Under pressure from President Dwight Eisenhower of the United States, alongside with the Soviets in a rare Cold War cooperation of the US and the Soviets, the British, French, and the Israelis were pressured to give up their conquests. The British and the French gave the Suez Canal back to the Egyptians, and Israel also withdrew from the Sinai and from Gaza, giving that back to the Egyptians. So here you can see the last day of the Israeli post office in Gaza Strip on 5th of March, 1957, and the first day of the Egyptian control of the post office on the 4th of May, 1957. If you look at this Egyptian postage stamp, it shows Gaza as part of Egypt. And here is a rally of Gazan residents on New York Times Magazine from 1957 saying, "We do not accept any rule except Egypt." Did they want to be Egyptians, or did they still believe in a Palestinian state that included Gaza and the rest of historic Palestine? Was this a propaganda rally? Hard to tell. But at the time, the idea of a Palestinian independent state was not as realistic as it is today, where they have so much international recognition. So many Palestinians did rely on Egypt as its protector, at the same time that the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser had viewed Egypt as the beginning of a future united Arab states, with Egypt as the leader. 1967 war. Egypt blockades the Mediterranean Sea, the Straits of Tiran, kicking the UN troops out of Gaza and the Sinai, massing Egyptian soldiers on the Israeli border. Israel launches a preemptive strike, sweeping across Gaza within a couple of days and into the Sinai Peninsula. The images from that time show the Egyptian commander in the Gaza Strip surrendering to the Israelis, Egyptian prisoners of war, and Israeli soldiers parading through the city. This is the main Palestine square in Gaza City. And here again, there were questions on what would be the future status of this land. Initially, the thought was that Israel would give back the West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights, and Sinai Peninsula in exchange for peace. But the Arabs were not interested in peace, so Israel did not give them back the land. By 1968, Yigal Allon, an important minister in the Israeli government and a general, had proposed building 5 Israeli settlement blocks in the Gaza Strip and northern Sinai to divide the Arab population there in order to reduce the chances for future invasions and resistance. And it was then that a military base was established on the site of Kfar Darom, which would later become a civilian settlement. Towards the 1970s, the first few settlements were now going into civilian hands. The Arabs of Gaza City and Rafah and Khan Yunis did not view them initially as a threat because they were built on the sand dunes along the coast called the Mawasi. They even laughed at the Jewish settlers. They would build land on a desert. But the Israelis had some experience in turning deserts into farms, and later was discovered there was a huge aquifer underneath as well. This created hothouses in the desert, bug-free vegetables that were growing in places like this seen here in Netzer Hazani. This is the Tucker family here, pictured here, activists of Gush Katif, as this block became known. Among the buildings there that became a landmark of Jewish settlement in southern Gaza was the synagogue in Neve Dekalim. And you can see a star-shaped building and this trademark orange rooftops. Another reason for the growth of the Jewish population in the Gaza Strip was the Camp David Accords of 1977, where Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, with the mediation of American President Jimmy Carter, had agreed to the Israeli withdrawal from every inch of the Sinai Peninsula. In exchange, Egypt did not press on the status of Gaza or West Bank, only for promises of Palestinian Arab autonomy. The Israeli settlements in the northern Sinai Peninsula were also evacuated under this agreement, including the largest of the Israeli settlements, Yamit, which means by the sea. It was a very emotional withdrawal, with many Yamit settlers refusing to leave. Some of them said, why can't they live under Egyptian rule? Egypt did not want Israeli settlers there. And so Yamit was demolished. Some of the residents of Yamit were then resettled in Israel proper, a few in the West Bank, but a large number in the closest land nearby, the Gaza Strip. And those examples included places like Neve Dekalim. Neve Dekalim was named after a place called Dikla, which means palm tree. It was there that during World War I, a Zionist spy working for the British, Avshalom Feinberg, was killed by a Turkish sniper. He had a palm seed in his pocket. The palm tree grew out of his body, and it became the legendary settlement of Dikla. Seeds from that palm tree were evacuated with the residents of Dikla and resettled in Neve Dekalim, where palm trees were grown anew. Within the Gaza Strip, within this block called Gush Katif, which means harvest belt, you had other settlements like Badola, named after a jewel, Gadid, Ganei Tal, Gardens of Dew, Katif, which means harvest, named after a nearby archaeological site called Katif, and Netzer Hazani, named after an Israeli minister, and a few others. There was a Jewish cemetery there, an Israeli airstrip as well. And at the time, in those early years of the 1980s, Jews could travel on Route 4, the coastal route, also known as the Saladin Road, to Israel proper. But it was a very violent trip, because often they would be attacked, thrown rocks, and sometimes worse. And gradually, as violence increased, the Jewish settlers of Gaza Strip had to go under military escort to go in and out of their homes. You also have an area called Mawasi, an area that was administered by Israel, but populated by local Bedouins. So Bedouins surrounded by Israeli settlements who were surrounded by Palestinian population who were surrounded by Israel. So sort of like a nesting doll of lands inside a land inside a land. This is an aerial view of the Gush Katif settlements. In the northern Gaza Strip, you also had another block of settlements, including Nisanit, which means on the sand, La Sinai, which means the sands of Sinai, and Dugit, fishing boat. Among the activists in LA Sinai was Avi Farhan, a Jewish immigrant from Algeria when Jews were expelled from Algeria after their independence, who settled in the Sinai, and after expulsion from the Sinai, settled in LA Sinai, and then was again expelled in 2005. So Jewish refugee several times in his life. Here he is shown protesting in 2005, the Israeli disengagement from Gaza. Ironically enough, the communities in northern Gaza were largely secular, while Gush Katif was largely religious. And the Israeli farming communities near the Gaza belt, as it was known, like Yad Mordechai, were also led by socialists. So ideologically and religiously, these were very diverse communities. You also had the Erez industrial zone near the Erez crossing into Israel proper. These were light industries, Israeli companies employing Palestinian Arabs from Gaza, economic opportunities. But within Gaza, there were plenty of activists who said, we don't want those. What we want is a destruction of Israel. And gradually, extremism and militancy had festered within Gaza City and Jabalia, even while Israel continued to provide work permits for Gazans to enter Israel, but not live there, or within the Erez industrial zone. The settlements as well had accommodated a lot of Palestinian Arab workers from the Gaza Strip. And Israel had hoped that economic prosperity would result in acceptance of Jews in Gaza, which they did not. These are images of the synagogue in Neve Dekalim, and the signs here showing the International Jewish Agency among those who built these communities. You can see LA Sinai, 1983, established a year after the last Jews were expelled from the Sinai. Chof Aza, Beach of Gaza Regional Council, the local government body that administered these Jewish communities. You can see how these communities were built on sand. There were no Arab homes here. So what's this talk about Jews displacing Arabs? But that's how the international community views it. You can see here a picture of Jews protesting the disengagement, another book called Grains of Sand by Shifra Shomron. But why did the Arabs claim these lands if there was just sand here? Grazing lands, perhaps aquifers underneath, but also just the principle of it, the thought that all this land belongs to Gaza Strip, belongs to Palestine. And it was in the late 1980s that Hamas had emerged. Israel initially did not view Hamas as a threat. They viewed them more as a religious movement, a movement of religious learning rather than political advocacy. But Hamas viewed the destruction of Israel with the same zeal as the People's Front for Liberation of Palestine, Democratic Front for Liberation of Palestine, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the most well-known and the one with the most international recognition, led by Yasser Arafat. The founder of Hamas was Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and Dr. Abdelaziz Rantisi. Yes, Sheikh Yassin here looks like Saruman, that villain from Lord of the Rings. But what happened here was in 1987, a Palestinian was killed by an Israeli truck, I believe, and the Israelis just kept driving. It turned into a violent outbreak of rage and upset at Israel that killed not only Israelis, but was also a revolt against Palestinian collaborators. It was here that in the first Intifada of 1987 to roughly 1992, that the village leagues that Israel attempted to establish to provide collaboration and cooperation were now discredited among the Palestinian population. Palestinian flags flew proudly. And Arafat, living in Tunisia at the time, had opened up, proposing peace with Israel in the Madrid Agreement, which later became the Oslo Agreement. A temporary governmental body called the Palestinian Authority was established, initially in Gaza and Jericho, and gradually administering what would become the majority of the Palestinian population. But the uncertain item during the Oslo Agreement was that Hamas had opposed this agreement. Hamas wanted all of historic Palestine for their state, not just West Bank and Gaza. And within West Bank and Gaza, there were still Jewish settlements there. Arafat had expected these settlements to eventually be dismantled. He had expected gradually for Palestine to get more political support internationally at the expense of Israel. But in those years, the 1990s, he was viewed as a peacemaker, receiving the Nobel Peace Prize alongside Israeli Prime Minister and former General Yitzhak Rabin. The opposition to this peace came from the Israeli settlers who had feared losing their homes, and it also came separately from Hamas, who feared losing their political support, as well as their dream of a full state of Palestine. Fatah, the main party of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, their administrator of Gaza was Mohammed Dahlan, from a local notable family. He was regarded very much as a strong voice for Palestine, but at the same time, someone who could cooperate and work with the Israelis. Mohammed Dahlan fled from Gaza after Hamas came to power in 2006. He now, I believe, lives in Qatar. But there's talk about Mohammed Dahlan returning to Gaza as the Fatah or PLO administrator once Hamas is defeated. But we're not so sure. 2005, Ariel Sharon, a former general, defense minister, now prime minister, nicknamed the Bulldozer, responsible for building so many of the Jewish settlements in the West Bank and Gaza, now came to the realization that demographically it did not make sense to maintain control of Gaza, where the Arab population was more than 1.4 million to only about 8,500 Jews. He came to the realization that giving up Gaza could give confidence to the Palestinian population in hope of peace. It would reduce the cost of a military that had occupied parts of Gaza, and many Israelis, especially secular Israelis, had no desire to remain in Gaza, viewing it as a place of death and not desirable to remain. Some of the settlements in the north, like El Sinai, Nisanid, Dugit, had evacuated willingly. Others, like Netzarim, Kfar Darom, and the Gush Katif bloc, fought back. Non-violent protests against the Israeli army, marches throughout the land of Israel under their signature orange color. The majority of the Israeli soldiers followed orders, believing in military discipline rather than a breakdown of authority. And so, within a month, in August of 2005, the Jews were evacuated from Gaza. Homes were demolished to prevent Jews from returning, as well as to give the Palestinians of Gaza their own opportunities to build, while synagogues and certain administrative buildings would remain for reuse. But once Hamas had stormed into former Gush Katif, the synagogues were burned, what the Jews regarded as desecration, but what the Palestinians regarded as a symbolic victory. Rather than crediting Ariel Sharon for this self-imposed withdrawal, Hamas claimed that the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza was the result of their years of militancy and violence. Victory parades were held. There were also Palestinian elections. At the time, US President George W. Bush had thought that it would result in democracy. But the people of Gaza elected Hamas, which then expelled Fatah, imposing this theocracy on the region and using their power to launch further attacks into Israel. From 2006 till 2023, there were numerous Israeli military operations into Gaza, but under international pressure not to reoccupy, as well as domestic pressure, and not the desire that they did not want to return, Israel attacked, bombed a few buildings, killed a few militants, and then went right back. And Hamas remained in power. And that led us to the attacks of October 7, 2023, when Hamas had the deadliest day for Jews in the land of Israel since 1948, the deadliest attack on Israel since the beginning of that country. From the age of 9 months to the age of 85 years, hostages were taken. And with all this talk of Palestinians who are killed, there's no access to the hostages. We don't know how many of them are alive at this point, a month into these attacks. And there has been some talk among religious Zionists of returning to Gush Katif. Don't know how realistic that is, but whether or not Israel returns to Gush Katif, I think it is important to remember that Gush Katif is not some settlement that came in the 1970s. It was built on the memory of centuries of Jewish presence that extends from the time of Samson to the Six-Day War. Today, we look at Europe. We see that French people can visit Germany. German people can visit France as tourists. The borders are not a subject of arguing. Perhaps there will be a day when Palestinians in Gaza can visit Israel and Israelis can visit Gaza while maintaining their sense of national, ethnic, and religious identity. The image here shows American Secretary of State Anthony Blinken meeting with Arab leaders. Who's not at the table? The Palestinians, because they still believe in militancy. We see supporters of Palestine around the world calling for a ceasefire, but that call only came after Israel went into Gaza. We see pro-Israel demonstrators keeping the memory going of the hostages. This is Gaza today. But again, we should think about what Gaza could be if there is cooperation and a recognition that Jews are not settlers. Jews are not occupiers. They are people with historic ties to the land of Israel with the inclusion of Gaza. I wish success to Israel, safety to its fighters, its people, and the hostages. Thank you.